Thank you. Actually, I am really thankful to Juxtapose. Since last year I was also one of the presenter, and I am here because Ma Yuge, she happened to be my student one point of time, and Barbara, I mean one of the most friendly person in England is Barbara. All Indian intellectual, including myself, look at her guidance, and she has been very, very generous. Now, we have decided that I will speak largely on the first two papers, and Professor Singh will speak on the second because time being very limited to us. Nonetheless, the presentations were really good, and they were good in the sense that they are not extempore in the sense they are a work of persistent work being done through various projects. And people have not only experienced or experimented with some ideas, but they have also experienced. Therefore, the criticism have to be, or the comment have to be slightly different than usual. I will just really restrict to a few. First of all, when one is talking of, Ping has really given very many models. To my mind, if you really, part of the answer lies if you bring the last paper which has been presented by Mahalakshmi, and this itself really becomes this whole issue of citizenship. How the citizenship really addressed, and how differential citizenship movements are there in India and China. Therefore, most of the issues can be really answered or understood. Because in India, whatever it may be, but citizenship has been an achievement. While in China, the only thing that eludes them is the citizenship. Citizenship can be defined in three ways actually. Right to produce, right to appropriate, and right to make history. Now the question is that in China, though, in terms of poverty or in many things, China will be much ahead. But what is not there is that the things that they get, do they get it out of choice or get out of option? I think in India we are more poor people than the China have. But also fact that China has been able to hide their poverty more than what we do. So it's not that China doesn't have poor people, like the West. West has been successful in projecting their democracy better because they have hidden their poverty much effective than we have done. And that is where the whole issue of citizenship lies. Right to produce, right to appropriate, and also right to create own history. Now this brings me to another question. I am really happy to listen here that the middle class, you aren't we giving the middle class what they are historically not supposed to be? It is the scum of the society. Middle class is not by position a class itself. It aspires to attain the status of a rich bourgeoisie, rich class, but it cannot. It sympathizes with the oppressed because this is what the counterweight they will use to bargain. They are basically the brokers, the power brokers. And we are all part of it. So therefore what middle class, that they aspire to take the lion's share in the cake, not by their own merit, but by counterweighting them by using sometimes environmental issues, sometimes gender issues, sometimes the ethnic issues, sometimes the citizenship issues, sometimes the global warming issues. But given the chance, they will be much worse than what the others are. So therefore middle class, because they do not have, in fact at one point of time, I don't know whether it is still there or not, some of them we used to call them a lumpen class actually. They don't have any social position itself. And in classical in France, Marx has said that they are the doltishly sublime. And that is how they can be characterized. The Habermasian path I have been telling you that please remember, Habermas uses a new kind of contradictions. The contradiction is between economy and state on the one hand, and society and life on the other hand. Now what is the mode of dialogue? The economy and the state would like to take on strategic actions, while society and life or culture would like to have the communicative action. Now as a result of that, when somebody says whether there is a pro-democracy movement or no democracy movement, basic problem is that the state is trying to tell people that strategic action is the rational action. While the citizens are saying, sorry, no, the rationality must be communicated. And that is what I really understand. This comes to me, what Rajeshwari said about the agriculture, rural transformation. Is it actually, please, when you are talking about rural transformation, can it be related to this is the logic of the system that both India and China are following? The indirect path of capitalist development, whereby capitalism cannot survive without colonies. Yes, now they cannot have external colonies. 1867, Sapal has told that world has been divided into colonies. Now no further division is possible. Yes, redivision is possible. Therefore you poach on others' colonies. And today what the capitalism is doing is that it is constructing colonies. For example, sometimes you conquer nature as colony, sometimes you conquer gender as a colony. Today capitalism has resorted to life and its organ as colony. Knowledge is a colony. The colony does not mean rule, domination. Colony means ability to construct. How knowledge is being constructed, how identities are being constructed, how life is being constructed. Today the major contradiction is that urban is trying to digest the rural, and the China is trying to digest these smaller identities. The so-called pan-Indian identity is trying to digest these smaller identities. That is the logic of capitalism. But yes, it does not do it very openly and blatantly. It hides. This is what again Marx used to say, that human beings are those animals who hide their chains with flowers. In the name of empowerment, the moment you think empowerment is the issue of any community, the disempowerment has been put into structures. The moment you think that you are love for environment, the days of environment are numbered thereafter. The moment they talk of freedom, that means the freedom will be the process by which people will be made slaves. And today what actually happening is that this is where the communicative action is. Freedom is the way that through which you will be enslaved. And today what we have to see is that what is the urban area of the industrial class is looking at this thing? The genetic knowledge, the genetic pool, the different kind of capitals, untapped, unknown capital, non-marketed capitals, non-marketed cultures. That is what their interests are. Gone are the days when they used to go, for example, surplus realization, resource exploitation, labor availability, creating market. Now today the entire process is that how in terms of knowledge, patenting, and therefore the entire issue of rural has really diversified. In fact, we are trying to move towards a completely regimented, standardized world hereafter, and rural is the one that is putting a resistance to it. It has to be seen in that light. James C. Scott says that the history of the people who do history is the history of this class struggle. The history of people who do not have history is the history of fighting against the state. And therefore, all these movements, the Jharkhand movement, or even somebody has Iram Sarkar, is not only APSA. APSA, it may be one of the issue, but the question is that the Garzan, when the Nagas, the Mizo, the Manipuris have not been part of nation, how can they be anti-national? Just because a signature was done on 14th of August, they become anti-national? Now they really want to redefine the nationality. Now Indian government, you are anti-national. What is the constitution? Constitution is social contract. Is the social contract an agenda in rural transformation? Is the social contract an issue when we are talking middle class? What kind of social contract middle class has? Constitution is not a valid category for India. Constitution valid category in America because it was constituted. In case of India, it has to be a social contract. Now, if social contract is not there, I mean, rural and urban, can you, the way China defines urban is the way India defines? In Nigeria, if you have pub is urban. In Israel, if you have a pagoda is urban. Can it be? Therefore, when you are talking urban, one must understand, it must be understood in terms of, are the social contracts different? And therefore, the papers are brilliant. this is not a criticism. What I am simply saying is that, since they have raised many questions, the strength lies there. And therefore, I'm really, I don't know that I have justified or not, but nonetheless, these are certain a few comments I would like to make. Thanks.
Thank you. It was fascinating listening to all the presentations and the questions and discussion. Though I had, as he rightly said, we decided that I'll focus on the third paper, but I might just also make very brief or put questions for the first two papers which you might want to take away with you. The first presentation and paper which talked about, and what I took away from it, talked about comparative environmentalism in China and India. It was interesting because this morning before I came here, I was at a workshop speaking in WWF, organized by WWF UK, and they were talking about the difference between environmentalism in the United Kingdom and in India. And it was very interesting that actually you have much more space for environmental activism in India than you have in the UK. Because the laws in UK, some of you might know, are such that you can hardly ever file a case in the courts in UK because you have the liability of paying costs of up to £100,000 if you lose the case. While in India you have no such liability, so you happily file cases, etc. And the important lesson from that was that perhaps UK can now live with these very anti-movement laws because their regulatory mechanisms work much better. While we are still at a stage of democracy where just by casting your vote and paying your taxes, you cannot then hope that democracy will work. You still have to participate as citizens. So the point I'm making is that as you look at these two models, must contrast them with these 2 points. One is what is the opportunities that the state provides, you have hinted upon that. But secondly also, what are the constraints that exist within that system? Now that doesn't come out very clearly. You might find that the environmental movements in China, though on the face of it they seem to be much more stunted, are actually much more progressive given the sort of lack of space there is in the Chinese system than they are in India. That needs to be debated, and I'd be fascinated, I'd be really interested in finding out how it works out. As far as the second presentation went, many issues and questions, but many have been raised. I just wanted to raise one. You had perhaps in passing mentioned that you're not sure why a lot of the concerns which social scientists have, policymakers, don't seem to take on board. Now, I must confess that I was for a while in the Indian Planning Commission, and so therefore can be accused of being a policymaker, and I was in charge of the Division on Environment and Forests, so that sense I had that thing. And I remember even at that time, this was, as I love to say, it sounds very nice, it was over a quarter of a century ago that I was there. But the interesting thing is that at that time I found that there was hardly any interaction between the government and the academia on most matters, barring perhaps economics a little bit. There's hardly any. We tried very hard to set up a system of interaction, but it didn't work. I won't go into details, but the question I want to put to you for your consideration, and you can think about, is that yes, I think policymakers in the government are ill-informed about the concerns of social scientists, but are you sure social scientists are also not ill-informed about the nature of reality? Because being an academic and a researcher myself, I feel that when you go in as a researcher, you see an entirely different reality to what happens when you are an administrator and things like that. And maybe we need to figure out the system by which the twain can meet so that there is a healthier interaction between the two. Finally, coming to the IAC paper, it might be unfair for me to comment on this because, as some of you might know, I've been very closely involved with this whole movement. I just wanted to make 3 or 4 points. First of all, I recognize the great problem in studying and analyzing something which is so recent, because things are still up in the air. Activists are not very good at recording things. You don't really know what happened. I just finished a detailed paper which will soon be there, which is where I've listed out and given details of all the meetings that took place. Because there is no public record, nobody really knows what went on, only things that came out, which was a very small iota. But having said that, let me simply say that there are 4 different questions about the Aam Aadmi Party and the IAC, and why I'm mentioning the Aam Aadmi Party is that though you did say, oh, look, we are not looking at the Aam Aadmi Party, we are stopping at IAC, I think it would be academically and politically unfair not to look at the IAC without taking into the context that it transformed into the Aam Aadmi Party, because a lot of what happened in IAC will be better understood if you see what happened at the end of the day. Now the 4 issues, and you mentioned one already, one is the role of the media. I'm sure you're aware that studies done show that the coverage the Aam Aadmi Party got in 2011, which is about 500 hours average per channel on TV, was more than anything has ever got. Anything has ever got in India. And I would dare say, I haven't done a comprehensive survey, but people tell me that they can't find any world event which had that much coverage. So that is one thing. Somebody else raised this question, I think you raised this question about what is the differential between the two. So that's one question which needs to be looked at. The second is the timing. And I think that's a very important issue. In fact, not just from the media point of view, I've argued that they timed it so well, and I know because I was present in those meetings, it was consciously timed just after World Cup had finished. And before one-day cricket was starting, there was this 5 days gap when TV had nothing to do and the listeners had nothing to see. So it was I'm talking about the first Jantar Mantar fast started. But also the timing in terms of, and this distinction doesn't seem to come out in the analysis, the first fast, and then what happened in the Ramlila ground, because there was a wonderful timing that happened. The first fast came just before 5 elections were about to take place in 5 states. And that is what led to the, and I can tell you this on record that a lot of senior politicians have admitted this, that the way the government backed down was because they had these 5 elections coming. And they said they didn't want the face of Anna Hazare on the TV, getting leaner and leaner every day because they were sure to lose votes because of that. So the timing is the second thing. Whether that timing opportunity gets provided in China or not is the other thing, and have they used it? I'd love to see whether that same sort of political timing was used in China, and perhaps it was, and it will be very fascinating. The third issue that I think you need to look at is the opportunism, and that's where you'll have to look at the Aam Aadmi Party as a part of the IAC movement. Was it an opportunistic movement or was it an ethical movement? And this is something you need to ask yourself as a political. I'm not taking a side here, I'm not taking a point of view. You might find a mixture of the two. You might find that some elements were opportunistic, some were not, etc. But was the demand really the Lokpal bill, which is what it was all about? Or was that only an opportunistic means to something else? That's the third question you have to ask. And again, I'm not saying what the answer is, but I'm just putting it across for your sort of consideration. The last, and which I also would love to, of course, there wasn't enough time for you to talk about China in greater detail. I know much less about the Chinese thing, is the response of the government. Now, you did talk about the famous Tiwari response, and there's also the famous Kapil Sibal response, etc., etc. But what is interesting is they backed down, got the IAC off, won the elections. Please remember that those 5 elections, UPA won 4 of those 5 elections in the states at that time. Came back, sorted out Baba Ramdev in a particular thing, got very sure of themselves and arrogant and acted in the way. I honestly believe that some social scientists should ask the question that if Anna Hazare had not been arrested and put behind bars, would there ever have been the sort of transformation that took place to the movement? And if so, how important was the reaction of the government in that particular point and what happened after that, etc. And the last point, and well, 2 points, because I also have to respond to his critique of middle class, if you don't mind, but the second last point is that I do think that you need to now look at it in retrospect and recognize that for all practical purposes, the India Against Corruption movement did not achieve what it was asking for. They did not get the Jan Lokpal bill. they did not get the judiciary under the etc. I mean, I don't need to go through that list. And that in itself becomes an important question to ask. Why did this happen? And yet, it's moved on. It's like, you know, never mind, that's not what we wanted. We wanted something else. Your attack on the middle class was interesting. I was squirming, being very much a part of the middle class. But I just wanted to make one small point, which is not a criticism of yours, but because the question was raised of how do you define the middle class. I think one of the things that came out very interestingly in the whole IAC and Aam Aadmi Party thing is that you had a class of people who were earlier not interested in being mobilized the way IAC mobilized. Anybody who argues that the middle class is not being concerned about problems in India is not correct. The whole environmental movement was by and large a middle class movement. There are so many others which are. But usually what used to happen, I have been a part of the environmental movement, that when you wanted people to go on the TV or the radio, write articles or come to seminars, the middle class was there. But when you wanted people out on the streets, you had to have people from the villages or from the bastis. You know, and that was the strength, and we all had to maintain our linkages with grassroots activists in order to be able to get 100 people onto the streets. That changed. You actually had well-heeled people outside the streets. Now, why that happened, I don't know. We'll find out. Will that happen again? I don't know. We'll find out. But it was a healthy thing that I don't have to disrupt my poor folk in the bastis who, as it is, don't have the time and have to earn a daily wage to come out on the streets. I can get all these business executives to come out, and I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. Thank you very much.
See, there was a comment about Chipko movement. Please, let me just tell you, he said that he is an environmentalist. Honestly speaking, Chipko movement started in my village and I was a member of it. The people, those who later appropriated it, please read Sankat Sundaral Bahuna's article of Dharam Yug in 1967, who later on became the greatest environmentalist. The title of the article is Ganga Maa Ka Shakti Roop. He recommended 43 mega dams of UP hills, the environmentalists of today. Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who is supposed to be another environmentalist, had 2 sawmills and saw not plant trees. Sawmill only cut trees. He had 3 turpentine factories. But because this is how the middle class character comes. They appropriate wherever they find that the eye on the pie. This is the character of middle class. They don't take any responsibility. They appropriate whatever space available to them. Therefore, environment is one of the biggest industry in this country to fool the real stakeholders and to amass wealth, popularity, space for themselves. Sorry, sir.
I am appropriately squirming.
Big clap for all the people. I think it was a very beautiful discussion. Yes. And of course, we have been served in the room itself. And now I think I was told that we will move to the session 4, which is chaired by Professor Bye.